The rain hammered the roof of the small Denver suburb house, each drop a cruel echo of the shouting inside. At 14, Elias Carter stood trembling in the living room, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his hazel eyes wide with fear. His mother, Lorraine, watched from the doorway, her face a mask of anguish as her husband, Tom, pointed at the door and roared, "Get out, and don't come back." Elias had come out to them an hour ago, his voice barely a whisper as he admitted he was gay. He'd hoped for understanding, maybe even love, but Tom's face had twisted into something unrecognizable. Lorraine's silence was worse. She didn't defend him, didn't move, didn't speak. The door slammed behind Elias as he stumbled into the storm, his sneakers soaking through, his heart splintering. He was alone, cast out into a world that felt as cold as the rain. The streets of Denver were unforgiving that night. Elias found shelter under a bus stop awning, his thin frame shivering as he clutched his backpack. Inside were a few clothes, a dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and a photo of him and his mom at a county fair, her arm around his shoulders, both of them laughing. He stared at it until the rain smeared the ink. How had it come to this? He'd always been the quiet kid, the one who drew sketches in the margins of his notebooks, who dreamed of a life bigger than their cramped, beige-walled house. Now that life felt like a fantasy. By morning, Elias hitched a ride to a youth shelter downtown. The place was crowded, smelling of stale coffee and desperation, but the volunteers were kind. A woman named Marla, with gray streaks in her hair and a voice like warm honey, gave him a cot and a hot meal. "You're not alone, kid," she said, her eyes crinkling with compassion. Elias wanted to believe her, but the ache in his chest told a different story. He didn't know if he'd ever see his mom again, or if he even wanted to. Over the next weeks, Elias learned to survive. The shelter connected him with a counselor, who helped him enroll in a new school under a program for displaced youth. He kept his head down, his sketches hidden, his truth buried. But at night, when the shelter lights dimmed, he'd lie awake, wondering if Lorraine ever thought of him. Did she miss him? Did she regret standing by as Tom threw him out? The questions gnawed at him, but he pushed them down, building walls around his heart. A year passed, then two. Elias grew taller, his voice deeper, his sketches sharper. At 16, he landed a part-time job at a diner, saving every penny for a dream he barely dared to name. Getting out of Denver, starting fresh. He met others like him, kids who'd been rejected, abandoned, but still fought to carve out a place in the world. One of them, a trans girl named Riley, became his first real friend. She taught him how to laugh again, how to find joy in small things like sneaking into a matinee or sharing a stolen cigarette under the stars. "Family isn't just blood," Riley told him one night. "It's who shows up when you need them." Elias clung to that, even as his mother's silence haunted him. At 18, Elias boarded a bus to San Francisco with $300 in his pocket and a heart full of hope. The city was a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Cable cars clanging, street performers strumming guitars, rainbow flags fluttering above Castro Street. For the first time, Elias felt like he could breathe. He rented a tiny room in a shared house, enrolled in community college, and got a job at a bookstore in the Mission District. The shelves smelled of old paper and possibility, and Elias found himself sketching again. Cityscapes, faces, moments that felt alive. It was at the bookstore that he met Javier Morales, a 20-year-old barista from a nearby cafe who came in every Thursday to browse poetry. Javier was all sharp angles and quiet intensity, with dark curls that fell into his eyes and a smile that made Elias's stomach flip. One day, Javier lingered at the counter, holding a worn copy of Neruda's love poems. "You ever read this?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Elias shook his head, blushing. "You should," Javier said, sliding the book across the counter. "It's like he's writing about us." Us became late-night talks over coffee, walks through Golden Gate Park, and stolen kisses in alleyways strung with fairy lights. Javier was out and proud, raised by a single mom who'd embraced him when he came out at 15. His confidence was magnetic, but it also scared Elias. What if love like this could be taken away, just like his family had been? Still, Javier's warmth chipped away at Elias's walls. One night, under a sky streaked with stars, Javier took his hand and said, "You don't have to carry it all alone, Eli." For the first time in years, Elias believed he might deserve this happiness. But the past wasn't done with him. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, Elias saw a notification from a Denver news site. His father, Tom, had died in a car accident. The article mentioned Lorraine now living alone in the same house. Elias's heart lurched. He hadn't spoken to her in 7 years, hadn't even known if she was still there. Part of him wanted to call, to scream, to ask why she'd let him go. Another part wanted to forget her entirely. Javier found him staring at the screen, tears streaming down his face. "What do you need?" Javier asked, his hand steady on Elias's shoulder. Elias didn't know. Not yet. He threw himself into his art, channeling the pain into vibrant paintings that caught the eye of a local gallery owner. At 21, Elias had his first show, a collection of works that told his story: loss, resilience, love. The night of the opening, Javier stood by his side, beaming with pride. Strangers praised Elias's talent, but all he could think about was the boy who'd made him feel whole again. Still, Lorraine's shadow lingered. He hadn't told Javier everything. Not about the night he was kicked out, not about the photo he still kept in his wallet. By 25, Elias and Javier were building a life together. They moved into a small apartment in the Haight, its walls covered with Elias's sketches and Javier's poetry. They talked about the future, maybe a trip to Mexico to meet Javier's extended family, maybe adopting a dog. But the past kept pulling Elias back. One morning, over breakfast, Javier slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a letter from Lorraine, forwarded from the shelter's old address. Her handwriting was shaky, the words simple. "I'm sorry. I want to see you. Please come home." Elias's hands trembled as he read it. Javier watched him, his dark eyes steady. "You don't have to go," he said. "But if you do, I'm with you." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't been back to Denver since he was 18. What would it mean to face his mother now, after all these years? What did she want? Forgiveness, redemption, or something else? The drive to Denver was quiet, the Rockies looming like sentinels. Javier held Elias's hand as they pulled up to the familiar beige house, now weathered and peeling. Lorraine opened the door, her hair grayer, her face lined with years of grief. She looked at Elias, then at Javier, and her eyes filled with tears. "You're so grown," she whispered. Elias didn't know what to say. The boy she'd known was gone, replaced by a man who'd built a life despite her silence. Inside, the house felt smaller, suffocating. Lorraine had kept Elias's old room untouched, his sketches still pinned to the walls. She told him about Tom's death, about her own regrets, about the church group that had changed her views on love and family. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have fought for you." Elias wanted to believe her, but the pain was still raw. Javier squeezed his hand under the table, a silent reminder of who he'd become. That night, In a motel, Elias broke down. Javier held him, whispering, "You're enough. You've always been enough." Elias realized he wasn't just grieving the past, he was grieving the mother he'd never had. But he also saw a chance, fragile and uncertain, to build something new. Back in San Francisco, Elias wrestled with his mother's apology. He wrote her letters he never sent, poured his confusion into his art. Javier was his anchor, but even he didn't know the full weight of Elias's secret. The photo in his wallet wasn't just a memory, it was a promise. At 14, as he'd stood in the rain, Elias had vowed to prove he could thrive without his family's love. Now he wasn't sure what that vow meant. One evening, at a poetry reading in the Mission, Javier took the stage. His words were raw, a love letter to Elias woven with images of storms and stars. The crowd cheered, but Elias's eyes were on Javier, his heart swelling with a truth he hadn't dared to voice. After the reading, they walked to their favorite park, the air thick with the scent of jasmine. Under a cherry blossom tree, Javier pulled out a small ring, his hands shaking. "Marry me, Eli," he said. "Let's build our own family." Elias said yes, tears streaming down his face. But the joy was tangled with fear. He hadn't told Javier about the letter he'd finally sent to Lorraine, inviting her to visit. What if she came and broke his heart again? What if she couldn't accept him, even now? The next day, he showed Javier the letter. Javier read it, then looked up, his eyes soft. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Lorraine arrived a month later, her suitcase small, her eyes nervous. She met Javier, saw their apartment, their life. At dinner, she hesitated, then said, "I didn't know love could look like this. It's beautiful." Elias felt a weight lift, but not entirely. There was still a secret he hadn't shared. Not with Javier, not with Lorraine. At 14, he'd written a letter to his future self, promising to never forgive the mother who'd failed him. He'd carried it all these years, a tether to his pain. That night, Elias showed Javier the letter. Javier read it silently, then pulled Elias close. "You don't need to hold on to this anymore," he said. "You're not that kid in the rain." Elias nodded, tears falling. He burned the letter in their tiny fireplace, watching the ashes curl. Lorraine joined them the next day at the park, where Elias and Javier exchanged vows in a small ceremony. She didn't just watch. She stood by them, her presence a quiet amends. The wedding was simple but radiant, with fairy lights strung through the trees and Riley as their officiant. Elias and Javier danced to a slow song, their laughter mingling with the music. Lorraine clapped, her smile genuine, if tentative. She was trying, and for now that was enough. Elias realized forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a choice, made over and over, to let love outweigh pain. Back in their apartment, Elias painted a new piece. Two figures under a starry sky, their hands linked, a faint outline of a woman watching from a distance. He titled it Home, not for the house in Denver, but for the life he'd built with Javier, with Riley, with the community that had become his family. Lorraine stayed for a week, listening to their stories, sharing her own. She told Elias about the years she'd spent wrestling with guilt, about the church that had opened her eyes to love's many forms. "I'm proud of you," she said before she left. "I always was." Elias didn't know if he'd ever fully trust her, but he was willing to try. He and Javier planned their future. A trip to Mexico, a dog named Luna, maybe a kid one day. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. He was more than the boy kicked out at 14. He was an artist, a partner, a survivor. Years later, at a gallery show, Elias unveiled a painting that told his story. A boy in the rain, a city of light, two hands joined under a sky of stars. In the crowd, Lorraine stood beside Javier, her eyes shining. The plaque beside the painting read, "For those who find home in love." Elias met Javier's gaze, and in that moment, he knew. He'd kept his promise to himself. He'd thrived, not despite his past, but because of the strength it had forged in him.